Well, welcome everybody to the webinar this evening. I hope you can all hear us, and we're looking forward to a webinar, and I'll introduce Tracey in a moment, where we're going to be talking about preparing for an interview, so a topic that I know we have a great interest as people are going through transition and starting to interview for roles. Just to introduce myself, my name's Sophia Koniarska. I'm the Director of Programmes and Partnerships at the OA, and I'll be facilitating the webinar this evening with Tracey. And introduce Tracey, our guest speaker, who we're very lucky to have this evening. Tracey is a senior resourcing business partner. She works with Zurich, currently in their in-house resourcing function. And Tracey's got over 16 years of interviewing and preparing candidates. So we're really lucky to have Tracey's experience and to share with you tonight her insight into the sort of recruitment world and how to prepare for interviews as well. So a brief overview of what we're going to cover in tonight's webinar. As you'll see on the screen, Tracey's going to take through sort of what does an interviewer want, the preparation, how to approach it during the interview, different styles and techniques, and we'll look at behavioural and competency style interviews, structuring your answers, and then looking at the assessment and selection tools that recruiters will use. So without further ado, I'll hand over Tracey to talk to us about, so what does an interviewer want? Over to you, Tracey.
Thank you, Sophia. So good evening, everyone. Firstly, thank you for joining. I hope you find this session really useful. And like Sophia said, please send any questions that you have, because I appreciate I will be talking a lot to you as an audience. So, so the first slide then. So as an interviewer, I've just prepared some information here in terms of what I'm wanting from my interviewee and during that time that I spend with the interviewee. So ideally is to make my job as easy as possible as an interviewer. Ultimately, to solve my problem. I'll have a vacancy in my team, and I'm looking for somebody to solve that problem that I have. During that time that I spend with you, I'd be wanting you to help me remember you as an individual. Of course, I'll be looking for the right person with the right skills and abilities, and also to see, and this is quite important, if you're the right cultural fit for the organisation, in addition to the role itself. And the session is obviously to verify the information that you're providing on your application and your CV. Ultimately, though, please remember this is an interview is a two-way process. So all of the things I'm expecting from an interviewee, I'd expect from the interviewee to be wanting things back from me as an interviewer as well. So it's a two-way process. So it's an opportunity for you as interviewees to find out as much as possible about what I'm looking for as well.
Okay, brilliant. So if we move on to the next slide, and I suppose really looking at the sort of preparation and you know, sort of looking at the basics as well. So
okay, so I mean, we have called this the basics, the things that we would expect interviewees to have prepared in advance. And like I said, this is very from my experience, and you know, other people may want different things, but these are general rules of thumb. So turn up on time, where possible. Prepare your journey. You'll be surprised how many individuals are running late and haven't prepared how long it's going to take them to get to a certain location, even turned up at wrong location. So yeah, but that kind of planning in terms of what journey you have to take is quite important. Appreciate the interviewer's time. It is likely they'll have more than one interview sometimes on some days, so their diary are probably, they're not able to move things. So if one is moving late, then it will impact the rest of the diary. Be receptionist aware. So this is an interesting one. This is more around the receptionist area. A lot of companies are very busy areas, so it can be advantageous and disadvantageous in terms of you can find out a lot of information while sat in reception. So if you've got enough time to spend some time there, but there's often queues in receptionist areas, so that will impact that time that you prepare to arrive in advance of your interview. Next slide is look the part. So check the dress code. A lot of companies differ So if I'm going to take Zurich, for example, each office at Zurich all over the UK specifically have different dress codes. So I work in the Swindon office, and very recently we've had a change of dress code. So it's called Dress Fuel Day. So I choose how I come to work in terms of what I feel is appropriate. So I know that's quite wide, but there are some rules around that. But it's not always office dress. So it's worth checking in advance, what would be appropriate to wear. So the next point really is be appropriate, but also be comfortable. So be comfortable in what you wear, and if it's something that really isn't style, then we're not expecting you to not be yourself. Do your research.
And Tracey, would you check that with you in terms of checking the dress code? Would that be something that you would ring the recruiter about in preparation, or drop the recruiter a note to say, could I just check what the dress code is? How would they go about doing that, and when?
So, like I say, each company could be different, but I've worked in a number of organisations where, in advance of the interview, if I'm inviting a candidate in for an interview, we have a discussion around preparing for the interview, and that would be one of the I guess more common questions in terms of what should I wear. So it's often discussed, but don't be afraid to ask the question, because it's no question is a stupid question.
Brilliant.
And the next part is do your research. So a lot of candidates I've interviewed in the past, or even my hiring population, it's surprising how many people don't know anything about the company that they're applying for. It's not to say that you need to be, the expert. It's just knowing why you want to work for that company, what things stand out about that company. So check what industry they're in, and know specifically why it is that company that you're wanting to work for. There's lots of ways in which you can find out about a company. Obviously, Google. Most companies now will have a corporate page on LinkedIn. You can, and through LinkedIn, then you can understand who your interviewer is. You can understand about them as an interviewer, what their background is. They may have contacts that you could speak to. But specifically, if anybody's heard of Glassdoor, Glassdoor is what we would call the TripAdvisor for employers. So you could search Zurich, for example, on Glassdoor, and it will give you a very probably up-to-date account of what Zurich is like as a place to work, and that will be from current employees and past employees as well. So it's very honest, but it's a really good go-to place to understand from the customer what their experience has been like. So like I said, very much a bit like TripAdvisor. If you're going to go on holiday, you go and have a look at TripAdvisor before booking anything. So, do your homework really on those companies.
Yeah, and I think that's a really important, using all of those sorts of methods to gain as much information, again, so you're as informed as possible when you're sort of going into that process, and you've got as many answers as possible, when you're sort of approaching that as well. So Glassdoor is definitely one that we know a number of our service leavers has found helpful as a tool in which to do the research before. So I think that's a really an important bit to point out, and sometimes that's a really good interview question, isn't it? I've often heard people ask that question around, how did you prepare for the interview? And actually, all of those things, doing your research, shows your sort of, keenness on the role, and your sort of keenness on engagement. Yes, that's really, really, really good sort of preparation basics there as well. So I think sort of moving on from the sort of preparation, you've sort of, where you're turning up to, you've done your research, you've checked sort of what's expected of you on the day as well. So I think moving on to some of the sort of the key tips during the interview as well. So if I just bring those up there for you, Tracey, to talk us through.
Yeah, so I've detailed some key tips here, but this is probably help in preparation as well. So it's about how do I want to come across. So these are obviously during the interview, but you can use these to help you prepare as well. So the first one is to be confident without being overconfident. So we expect nerves in interview. It's not a bad thing, and actually nerves can bring out some very, very good behaviours in people as well. But it's a difficult one to try and, kind of prepare yourself to not be nervous, or to, I guess it's the overconfidence, because it's not a nice, I guess it's not the best trait to see from individuals when it's almost like, of course they can do the job, because actually that's what I'm trying to find out. Be honest. It's such a valuable, I find a valuable tip with your answers. You know, when you're asked to provide example on your experience, you know, honesty is the best policy. You know, use examples because they are part of your experience, and then you're able to articulate things better. Think about your body language. I guess that goes without saying. It's like if you're slouching, I guess you don't look as interested perhaps. So it's just again a tip to think about how you're positioning yourself. Keep eye contact with the interview as much as possible. You may find that you will go to interviews and there'll be more than one person in the interview, but keep eye contact with the person that is asking the questions, because then you can come across as more engaged, and it helps with the listening ability in terms of what it is that the interviewer is trying to ask. So again, then moving on seamlessly, listen to the questions. If you don't understand a question, you can ask them to repeat or rephrase, or even ask them to move on, if possible, to move on to the next question, and think about how you're going to respond to that one. It's not, it's not uncommon that a question will make some people stumble because they're not quite sure or can't think of a relevant example. So we can park questions and then move on and go back as and when required. Take notes. So this is probably this is about taking notes during the interview. So, for example, when you're finding out about the role a bit more from the hiring manager themselves, if you're taking notes about what they're saying about the size of the team, where the future of the role is going, it'll help you then if you need to follow up on certain things after the interview. But taking notes to the interview as well on yourself to help you prepare for the actual interview itself is acceptable. So you can take your CV, anything that you've done to prepare for the interview, you can refer to them. I've never been in an interview where I've said, no, don't use those. I want you to just kind of work without those. I encourage it because it forms more of a fluid conversation because people have got their evidence in front of them. Switch off your mobile. An obvious one, but there's nothing more than a distraction when a phone is ringing and can put you off kind of, I guess, concentration, etc. I have been in interviews when the fire alarm has gone off, so I've had to take the candidate outside of the building, but these things happen. But yeah, generally, if you can avoid anything from interrupting, then try and prepare in advance. So prepare questions to ask. If there's something that you haven't found out during the application process, there was information on the job advert that you want to explore in more detail, or just things that generally you haven't found out and you'd like to ask the interviewer, prepare some questions in advance. It only help you to understand more about the role and what we're looking for. And be enthusiastic, even if you think the job isn't for you. What I found from my experience is that if I come across a really good candidate that I think, you know what, we can refer this candidate. I have a team of recruiters. I work within the recruitment team. We're always discussing how other roles may come about, and we can, we what we call talent bank candidates. So people share candidates if you've come across really well but aren't right for this role, but you can be thought about for other roles, and that's the opportunity then to highlight any transferable skills you have. And just the final point really is I wouldn't say don't interrupt, but choose your timing if you're not quite sure in terms of what it is. And that, again, I would say that's probably self-explanatory in terms of that advice.
And just a question we've had in, and I think it's reflecting on the sort of transferable skills element, but also the sort of, being honest. So, for example, if a military candidate is asked, if you've got a sort of stock set of questions and that you would ask candidates, and perhaps there might be a very specific question that would normally refer to people if they had the right commercial knowledge for that role, and the military candidate might not necessarily have the commercial experience. How would you sort of suggest the listeners approach that? Is it sort of, just as you say, be honest and reflect the fact, well, I don't have that experience directly in the insurance industry or the financial industry, but this is what I do have, and be prepared to sort of, reflect that rather than sort of perhaps trying to shoehorn it in a bit too much? How would you sort of, approach that as a question?
Okay, so I will be moving on to it later in the slide deck. But at Zurich specifically, and all of the organisations I've worked in, we don't use standalone technical questions. An interview is generally, and I say this is general rule of thumb, is built up with behavioural questions as well as those technical questions that truly find out what technical ability you have. So there's transferable skills within that. So you may not have done a specific thing, but actually you may have done something else, and that can be transferred across. But the behavioural side of things is understanding what have you done in the past that can be transferred into this environment. So it's more around that ability to drive something through, because we're looking for let's say, ability to problem solve rather than ability to, to write code. So it's a mixture. It's definitely a mixture. So we would look at that competence level in terms of ability, but there will be an element of technical ability as well. But we will look at the skill set needed rather than specifically technical skills on their own.
Brilliant. As you say, we'll come on to sort of look at what a competency-based interview is as well, and how to approach that. But some really good tips there, Tracey, to sort of take into sort of the interview as well and keep in mind. And so then just moving on to that, and sort of, the interview's happened, and after the interview, what do you do, and how do you approach that, and what's the best advice to sort of follow that up?
Okay. So you've had the interview. These are things to probably think about, not necessarily having to do, I guess, as an approach that you must take, but they're almost like a nice touch, and we do get it from candidates more often than not, but it does help the interviewer, but also the recruiter who's managing the vacancy, to then send on that email to the hiring manager, etc., just to say, this is what this candidate thought about, the interview and the role. So it's just a follow-up thank you email we recommend, just to say thank you for the time, but also reconfirming your interest in the role, and also how you, again, just touching on those things that you may have taken notes on in the interview, just touching on how you feel that you absolutely feel that actually following that interview process, I do think that I'm the right person for the role. It's almost like reconfirming, but based on some clear, I guess, points that have been picked up during the interview, not just an email for email's sake. And of course, worth noting here that not all interviews will be successful. So even though you may have sent through this follow-up, it's about being remembered. So you might not be suitable for the position that you've just interviewed for, but this whole post-interview process is putting allowing the recruiters and the hiring managers to remember you, and therefore potentially put you on this, future talent bank for other roles that may come about. If you haven't been successful, then use an opportunity to ask feedback. Feedback is such a crucial part of an interviewing process, which I'll go on to the next one. So it will help you with future job applications to understand what it is that, was deemed, the reason why you weren't successful, but what can you work on for future roles. or future interviews. But perhaps this may be the first time that you've interviewed for a long time, and the first opportunity may be successful, but it may be that you have to do it a number of times before you get a successful outcome. But most of the time, we'd like to think that the feedback that we're providing for the reasons why you weren't successful are then used to help you for those future applications. And again, it's about that, what else can you do? And, these other opportunities that we may have within the business that allows you to be part of what we call our pool of candidates that we go back to when we have future opportunities.
Yeah, so it's really thinking about that, so the interview process end to end as well, isn't it? And not just the bit in the room, it's the after piece as well. And I just wanted to pause. We've got a few questions come through, which I think might be sort of relevant to us now, if that's okay, Tracey.
Yep.
One is, perhaps it's sort of, is this something you ask after the interview or during, and who do you ask it to about salary? When is it appropriate to ask about salary, and how would you go about sort of bringing that up without it sort of distracting from, the sort of role itself?
Okay, so I can only go on processes that I've been involved in my recruitment experience. So more often than not these days, before an interview, you'll have perhaps a very brief telephone conversation with with the recruiter who's looking after the vacancy. So I'm talking from experience because I've worked from in-house recruitment teams. So part of my role is when I have candidates that have applied for roles I'm looking after, the first point of contact that I have with that candidate is to go through it's not a telephone interview, but it's almost like an understanding of the candidate's background in a bit more detail, and salary is always covered off during that call. Yeah. So, to manage expectations of the candidate, but to also then, not to waste anyone's time. So, if we're completely out of kilter, then, we'd have that conversation at that time to say, we're not on the same kind of path here. And then the information that I then provide, if I'm not interviewing with the hiring manager, the information that I provide to the interviewer and the hiring manager is that this is the criteria. So generally, I wouldn't put a candidate forward if we're not on the same path when it comes to salary. Yeah. But we also encourage the interviewers at the time to, at the end of the interview, we'll have probably some housekeeping questions, what we call housekeeping questions, to just go through notice periods, start dates, any upcoming holidays, and more specifically salary. So it is discussed throughout the process, and it is discussed at interview, whether it be driven by the interviewer. If it's not, I would recommend asking the question again. If it hasn't been asked up until that point, it's really important information about the successful candidate. So, and it's about managing expectations for both parties.
Yeah. So now, and as you suggest, perhaps even if it hasn't been uttered, going back to the recruiter, the initial person who's looking after the role, as a sort of, checking in point to sort of have that discussion, either at the start or through the process, depending on the company's sort of approach to it. But having that conversation with the recruiter is expected. It's not a uncouth thing to do. It's a sort of, it's an expected part of the process as well to have that conversation.
And a lot of recruitment, let's call them recruiters like myself, we are driven by candidate experience. So how is put ourselves in the candidate's shoes. So it's all about making sure that the candidates are aware, and also, like I say, that expectation piece. It has happened. I've been in a situation where we've got to offer stage and we've offered a candidate a salary way below what they were expecting, and ultimately a lot of time was wasted from both sides, and it wasn't a great outcome for us as a team, but nor so for the candidate, because for some reason those questions hadn't been asked at the right time.
Brilliant. And then just one more question that I wanted to ask in this section, and there's a few more for later, but at this point, in your experience around sort of feedback, and I presume it will vary from company to company, how often are companies willing to give that feedback? Is that something that sort of, if candidates ask, is, generally given, or is it something that sort of, is out of the norm to give feedback? And I think some of our audience perhaps have had sort of mixed experiences as to when to ask for that feedback and how often it's actually given.
Okay, so there's a couple of parts there. So if, let me just, how can I phrase? So depending on what stage of the process a candidate gets to. So for example, if an application is for some reason deemed unsuitable right at application stage, it is unlikely that feedback will be given. Only because the number of applications per role at times that we can receive to go back to all candidates to tell them why they've been unsuccessful is probably not something that we can do, but you'll certainly know whether you've been unsuccessful or not. If you get to face-to-face interview, we absolutely guarantee that we will provide feedback, and that's because we recognise the time spent from the individual coming in, and a lot of candidates have to travel, and we do offer feedback following face-to-face interviews. It's not automatically given, but we offer candidates the opportunity. So, for example, you'll have a call to say that you've been unsuccessful. We won't necessarily give you feedback. Some people don't like to receive the feedback there and then because they've just been told that they haven't got a role that they've set their heart on, for example. So we offer an opportunity then to have another call to provide them with that feedback. So we do encourage it. But like I say, it is post face-to-face interview because of the stages that we can have during the application process. So it's post that final decision point really that the feedback is offered as well. Okay, I think now it'd be good to move on to the different sort of interview styles and types that we've just sort of reflected on as well. So it'd be great if you could sort of just take us through those, Tracey. Sure. Okay. So I may have talked through a few already. So telephone based, as it says on the tin. So you might get an interview that is we'd like to speak to you for 15 minutes for a quick telephone interview. Normally those are to understand the details you provided in a bit more detail before we've put you forward to the next stage. So it's just about that fact finding to cover off the housekeeping things. And just to qualify the individual and make sure that we have all the information that we have on you before the next stage. And the next stage is more than likely to be a face-to-face interview, normally with the interviewer who is the hiring manager. We encourage at Zurich 2 people to interview. That's purely our policy here. So somebody then is driving the questions, and then the other person in the room is generally taking the notes, so the interviewer can concentrate on the interviewee and give them their time, rather than more often than not you find that they're face down either on an iPad these days collecting the notes, or scribbling down on paper. So it's about that engagement of the interviewer with the interviewee. You can have more than interviewers, 3 or more in a panel interview. I can't remember the last time that I've ever invited a candidate to a panel interview at Zurich. All my past roles, it's become a bit more old-fashioned now to have more than people. But again, it might depend on organisation. But I haven't ever invited a candidate into an interview with more than 3 people, if not more than 2 people. But what I have done is invited candidates in for multiple levels of interviews. So depending on the level of the role, a lot of people have a vested interest in the vacancy. You may have to come in and see different people at various times. If we could get all those people in one room at one time, it would probably be easier. But more than likely it's like a number of occasions that you'd have to go in and meet with people. And then assessment centres. So assessment centre is normally driven from a volume need. So whether it be because of the volume of candidates who are deemed suitable that need to be assessed, or because there is a number of vacancies to fill, and then it's easier to do that on an assessment centre basis. So during that assessment centre, there will be often a timetable of different assessment tools and sessions that the candidate will need to alternate round in order for the suitability of that role to be assessed. So it's either because of volume, or it's because it needs more than an interview to understand whether that individual is going to be right for a role.
Yeah.
It's often we use it for our volume. So let's take our telephone-based advisors, of claims advisors in Zurich. Not only an interview standalone is often not enough information to glean from a candidate. So you can understand their background and their behaviours, but we need to understand how they come across on the telephone. So we involve things like a role play activity and sometimes ability tests. So which I'll come on to later in the slide deck, but understanding an individual's ability, but they're all involved in one day within an assessment centre.
And as you say, Tracey, Glassdoor is also a really good tool as well for companies. If you want to find out what types of interviews companies use, again, that's often found on Glassdoor, is referencing that different companies use different styles as well. So it's a good research tool to find out the style of interview that a company might do.
And prior to the interview, so if you're invited to an interview of some kind, I'd like to think that you would be given information about what that's going to entail. So, for example, if we were to, Zurich are to invite you for a face-to-face interview, we'll explain what that face-to-face interview process looks like. And again, if we were to invite you to an assessment centre, we detail what that assessment centre will involve. So you've got all the information in advance.
Brilliant.
We also obviously, as part of our assessment process, we do use biographical information in terms of what's on a CV. So, for example, we may need a certain qualification for a role, and therefore we'll use information provided on the CV. And that's often where we'll find that candidates won't get past a certain stage of the process because it's a prerequisite that we're looking for an engineering qualification, etc. And behavioural competency style type of interview, I'll go through further in the slide deck. Technical interview, we tend to combine our interviews here. So if we're looking for certain behaviours and competencies, then we'll add a couple of technical questions, often just to explore the technical ability of an individual. And if there's any tests involved, we use a specific testing program, essentially. So we always allow our candidates to do some practice tests in advance as well. So they're quite familiar with the way that the tests will come before they actually start the test.
Brilliant. And just one question we've had, and I don't want to, because we're not focusing on CVs at this point, but just you bring up the sort of biographical and CV based. So a candidate recently, they're not working at the moment. They've sort of got a gap in the CV, and the recruiter sort of asked them about that gap as well.
Yeah.
Your advice if people are doing something else, how do they approach that? Is it just honest and saying, this is what I'm doing with my time at the moment? I'm doing up a house, or I'm taking a career break. How would you sort of advise candidates to approach that sort of what they're doing at the moment if it's not sort of directly work related?
Yeah, exactly that. We get it quite often actually. A lot of people will take career breaks. A lot of people will just decide to go travelling, or, like you say, look after family. And it's about being honest. The process of onboarding at Zurich is we will carry out background checks, and as part of that will be that biographical, well, there's a gap here, and we'll often, because we can't get a reference from an employer, we'll get character references and things like that just to verify those gaps and understand what it was. So it's all about being honest, because actually as part of our process, we follow up on that anyway. So, you know, you've already told us about it. There's nothing to hide. It's just that's why I wasn't employed at that time.
Yeah, and it's not a negative thing. It's actually quite a positive thing to talk about what you're doing, you know, outside of work as well.
Yes.
So
exactly.
Yeah, that's a really good thing. Okay, I think now if we move on to, we've talked quite a bit about sort of competency. We've mentioned the word as well and behavioural style. So I think it'd be good to just sort of talk through this at the moment, Tracey. That'd be brilliant.
Okay, what is a competency? So it says here skills you've learned or what you can do, not how you do it. So it's more about your ability to do something, not the way in which you do it. I don't want to overcomplicate things. So there's a saying here: the quality of being adequately or well qualified or skilled. So it's when we look at competency style interviews, is to understand your ability to do something. And when we come to the behaviour side of a competency behaviour style interview, it's about the things that you do naturally. So how do you go about something, because that's your natural manner of conducting yourself, particularly towards other people. So a lot of, and we'll move on to it in a second, a lot of questions are based around how, provide an example of a time when you've done X, Y, Z. And that's normally an opportunity for a candidate to talk around the situation. Who did it involve? How did you go about doing it? What the steps did you take? And then what was the outcome? So it touches the way in which you do things, and it often brings out that natural approach of people.
Brilliant. I think that's, you know, I think that's really good, and I think it just gives people a sort of understanding of, you know, how those questions might come across and what to think of that as well.
So there's more here. So I'll go to a competency-based interview. As I touched on, will draw out both the skills and the supporting behaviours. So, for example, our competency at Zurich may be manage ambiguity. This role will need somebody that I'm recruiting for to manage ambiguity. So the behaviours that typically we'd be looking for someone to demonstrate, to be able to demonstrate that they can manage ambiguity, because I wouldn't be asking, the question wouldn't be how do you manage ambiguity, the question would be tell me about an example of when you've done something, but the behaviour would be looking at how the individual copes well with setbacks, takes a solution-orientated approach under pressure. So that's the type of thing that we'd be looking for under that competency heading. So the question, for example, could be provide a recent example of when you were faced with a complex problem and had limited information available. And then how did you reach a solution? So that question is worded in a way that it's asking you to talk through an example, a problem, but actually we're looking for how you cope well with setbacks. And it kind of, I'm so used to doing it now, you know, in terms of a competency style approach. But what if it comes across as you don't know what is that ultimately I'm looking for? We at Zurich will pre-brief candidates before they come in for a competency interview, telling them what it is, but also list the competencies that we're going to assess. We won't obviously give them the questions, but we'll say during the interview we'll be looking at 5 competencies, and maybe communication, manage ambiguity, and things like that, and resilience. And it's about that preparation, thinking about what type of things could I provide to allow me to answer a question when I'm approached to how resilient am I.
Yeah, and I think that example piece comes over really strongly is if a company does provide the competencies beforehand, or they have values in which they recruit against, it's really having those examples ready, so you can sort of, you know, depending on what combination and how the question comes out, having, you know, your pre-prepared examples in your head to adapt those to the questions that the interviewer is asking, and sort of, you know, providing, and that provides the evidence that you're looking for as well. So it's that preparation is key there. Yeah.
And some of the prepared responses for competencies can cover a lot of areas as well. So even though we do sometimes encourage actually we could use your previous example, but we do encourage as many examples as possible, just so you've got enough to answer the questions. But generally, we won't cover more than 5 competencies. So if you went in with 7 to 8 examples, then they should cover the questions that you might receive. So that's probably a good rule of thumb in terms of how prepared would you be in terms of the competencies, is just have some examples in your head or written down, because we encourage notes to think how would I approach a question related to resilience, or the ones that we've listed for you.
Yeah. I think that's really good, because I think that preparation also, because it's quite hard sometimes to think on the spot of examples. So if you've got your pre-prepared examples, then you can adapt those to the questions that are being asked as well.
Yeah.
So just moving on to sort of, you've had the question asked, how do you structure your response as well? Then it's how do you get across, and how do you, as the interviewee, sort of provide that evidence for the interviewer as well, so that they can sort of make sure that you're hitting the mark. So structuring your answers, Tracey, how do you sort of, what advice would you give?
Okay, so at Zurich and previous organisations I've worked for, we use what they call the STAR approach. So it's detailed here on the slide. So when thinking about that evidence, like I said, most of the questions are framed in the way where we're asking you to provide an example of a situation when you've done something. So the first part of that structuring that response would be to explain the situation. So, it's an opportunity there for you to just give a brief overview of what was the situation, where were you working at the time, what was your role, and what was happening. Because more often than not, a candidate can come across and start talking about a role that perhaps I or the interviewer doesn't really understand the role that they were doing. So a very brief explanation of what was happening at the time is really good to start off the example with. Then the T part of STAR, explain what your task was. So what was it specifically that you were required to do in that situation? What action did you take? So to that situation, what you were doing, what did you put in place in order to overcome whatever it was that situation was happening? And specifically, where candidates often struggle on this part is that they don't individualize their responses. So we more often than not, and I've just said it myself, we comes out a lot in an example. So we did this or we did that. Interviewers are looking for what it is specifically that the individual did. So when you're explaining what action you took, personalize it to you and what was your role and what decisions did you make, and try to avoid what we did, because it just shows more about what it was that you were responsible for doing, and therefore how accountable were you in certain situations. And then it leads into the result then, what was the result of the action that you take rather than the action of you and 7 others, because we find it hard to understand ultimately, what was your role if you don't tell us. And I think it's reported to member I then brief, which I didn't realise was at the bottom of the slide.
Yeah. No, and I think that's really important, particularly for the audience here in terms of the service leaver audience, because they're very used to talking about in the collective term and the we. So really drilling down and understanding what their individual action and role was, and sort of really spending time thinking about that and how they articulate that, because it's not a natural thing to do when coming from the military, but that's what's expected, in in a civilian organisation as well. So really spending some time and sort of almost sort of thinking about it from a different perspective and sort of changing your language as well, so that you can give the evidence to the recruiter that they're looking for. Because, I mean, would you agree, Tracey, the recruiter wants you to provide the evidence. They want you to sort of, be successful in providing evidence to you. So, being able to sort of articulate that from, as you say, the sort of impact of the individual is so important.
Yes. Yeah, it is, and it is. I mean, I can provide advice, but it is something that a lot of people struggle with, because on a day-to-day basis, particularly in roles that I see in my own work environment, it's often a team effort, and to get to a resolution, whatever the situation is, there's often more than just one person involved, but it's about that role specifically that the individual took. What did you do, and why? Why did you do that, and what was the result because of your actions within that particular example?
Yeah, brilliant. Okay, so I'm just. I think we'll probably move on now to the sort of assessment and selection tools as well, and some more great advice here about sort of for candidates to understand from your perspective as a recruiter. What tools are you using, and how do what they do fit into that as well? Okay,
so I think I've touched on a few of them. So depending on role, depending on organisation, it might not just be a face-to-face interview that you may be asked to participate in as part of an application process. So I touched on ability tests. So in some places they're called aptitude, but they're pretty much the same type of test. So verbal and numerical reasoning are most common. So they're tests that test the ability to understand your reasoning. And it's hard to explain. So, for example, you could get a numerical reasoning test and automatically assume it's a maths test. And it is there or thereabouts, but it's understanding your ability to use maths in certain situations. So there will be a mathematical element to the test, but it won't be a pure maths test. It will be understanding that reasoning around the way that you use maths, if that makes sense. So ability test is your ability to reason with verbal and numerical information, and they're the most common. They can be done in a classroom-based environment, so pen and paper, or more often than not, they're online. So as part of a process, an application process, you might get invited to, before your interview, to complete some ability tests. They shouldn't be used necessarily all the time, unless we could demonstrate that if you don't pass these tests, you could absolutely say you couldn't do that role. That is very slim in terms of being able to justify that. So at Zurich specifically, we use them as part of the ongoing assessment. So prior to interview, you may be asked to complete an ability test because of the type of role and what we're looking for, but it'll be used in combination with the interview as well. It won't be a standalone. If you don't score a certain mark, then you don't go any further. But for certain roles and role types, it can be used as well, but it needs to be very specific that you can say if you don't score well in these tests, then you're not suitable for a role. And that's quite hard to justify. So situational judgment tests, again, a different type of test. So these are used to understand how you respond to different scenarios. So you'd be given a scenario to read through, and then you'd be asked to how you respond. These are often done in almost like pre-recorded, whether it be an online test where you're given a number of scenarios to respond to, or we started using, particularly for our graduate recruitment, is video-based judgment test. So you'd be asked to log into, you'd be sent a link to have a look at a video, and part of that video, as somebody speaks to you the situation, you then respond by recording yourself. So that's a different way of doing things, but a lot of these are written responses, so we can have that record of your response and then obviously understand your responses in more detail. And then personality profiling. So this is about drawing on your preferred style of working. So one of the tests that we use at Zurich, and I've used in the past, is what they call an OPQ, so it's Occupational Personality Questionnaire. So it is a questionnaire rather than a test. So it's a question is posed and saying, how would you prefer to work in the, it'll give you a question, and you have to say how you, there'll be a few selected responses, and you choose how you prefer to respond. And it's about your preferences rather than your ability, but it's for myself as interviewer, is to understand more about the individual and how they would have a preference to work and behave. Again, that's one of those ones where it's all about honesty, and try not to think about what you want us to hear, because there is some trick questions. I shouldn't say that, but there's some questions posed within that questionnaire that is phrased in a different way, and it is very clever in understanding whether you're trying to look in a fairer light than actually how honest you're being as well.
And I think it goes back to that two-way process of you giving an honest answer, and if your answers, or if you don't match the culture, or if you don't match actually what the individual, what the organisation is looking for, then you're not likely to be successful, once in the role as well. So you probably won't, beat the test, as it were, but B, is that the right, if it's exactly. Not matching, then is that the right environment for you to be in as well? So I think
that's a really good point. I think I mentioned it right at the beginning about, use an application process for a company to make sure that it's the right role for you. And some of these tests or some of these interviews, and even, your initial call with a recruiter, you may find out information, think, actually, I'm not sure if this is the right role for me. Use that to make the decision. We don't want to waste anyone's time. We want, this is about people's careers and next stages. Some of these decisions can be quite life-changing, so it has to be right for both parties.
And I think that's it's that two-way process is so important, and making sure when you're having those decisions, and just reflecting on the test as well. Is there anywhere people can practice the tests if they haven't done a sort of online test before and they're doing the sort of live one? Can people practice sort of ability tests and things online? Is there anywhere, or is it sort of?
There is. I can't remember the site. There is but specifically we use a company that do the online tests for us, and we would direct candidates to that site in order to have a look at tests, but understanding what level and what you're going to receive. When a candidate is invited to complete a test, as part of the registration process, they are given some tests to practice, and you can practice them as many times as you want before you actually say, right, I'm ready to start now. It's all under your own time. That's why we do them online. So we would send out a link to a candidate to say, you've got probably a couple of days to do this before your interview, and use the time wisely, but also practice how quickly you need to answer, because they are time-based. So you will be given an allocator. As soon as you press start, you need to be quite comfortable that you're ready to go. You're in a quite quiet environment, and then be prepared that you practice enough to know the type of questions. You won't get obviously the questions that will be asked within the test, but the type of questions and the way in which they're phrased, practice them as much as you want.
Yeah, and I think that's it. It's that practice and preparation again is key to that as well. Now, we're moving on to the final questions, and what I would say is we've had so many questions that have come in, and we're not going to be able to get to them all tonight as well. I think it's one of the most of the webinars I've facilitated. We've had the most questions I think we've ever had, so it's testament to how important this topic is. But what I would say is we'll finish off with a couple more questions now. Yeah. But Tracey's colleague Rebecca will also be doing a webinar looking at sort of delving into some of these issues again next week as well, on on Tuesday evening. So we can send some of these questions across in advance. And if we don't get to them all now, we can sort of follow up with those questions as well with Rebecca next week. So those of you that haven't signed up, do sign up for that next week, available on our website. But just a final few questions before we sort of do sort of some final polls and wrap up. One of the questions we had, Tracey, was how long after an interview should you follow up? And you've had the interview, sort of you're dying to know and you haven't heard anything. What's the sort of general time that you should follow up with in your experience?
I would say within 48 hours. I would say if you had a late interview on I wouldn't say go home and follow up. Perhaps the next day, but almost like it's almost about that opportunity to be remembered. I think I mentioned it earlier. It's like if you don't follow up the next day, it's not going to reflect badly. But is that follow up, as long as it's received in a timely manner? But I would say 48 hours maximum. But it may, more often than not, after the interviewer will give you guidance of how quickly you will hear. So, for example, if they say you will hear by the end of the week and it's a Tuesday, I would make sure you follow up within that time frame. Obviously, post obviously outcome, but almost gauge that kind of, actually, if I follow up now, then I'm putting that impression, or I'm just letting the interviewer know that I am really keen.
Yeah, and it can be different from different interview processes. Again, the queue, it might be that they need to speak to somebody else internally that's on holiday, so they might say, we won't be back for another week, etc. as well. So it's just sort of understanding what the timeframes are, or the different sort of processes that interview has to go through as well. So it's sort of understanding that.
And that's a really good question to ask, actually. During the interview, understand what comes next. If they haven't already outlined the process, it's worth saying, after this stage, is there another stage? What is the next stage in the process? And how soon will I hear? It's useful to follow up.
Yeah, and that was actually leading to just one of the questions we had is, at the end of the interview, tips for sort of questions that people could ask as well. If you've not got any sort of burning questions, as you say, that one there about what's next in the process, anything else that you sort of, candidates regularly ask you and you sort of expect people to ask at the end of a process, or any other tips for what people could ask about?
A lot of candidates, and it often puts the interviewers on the spot, is almost asking them, what were they looking for? In terms of then understanding, have I met some of those things? Some of the tips I've already talked about, but I would really suggest almost like picking up on something, maybe not a question you've already prepared in advance, picking up on something that you've learned during the interview about the team. I always ask about the future element of the role. To almost come across as very engaged in terms of you've understood what they're saying, but understand where that team is going, what their challenges are, and I think a question around the role and its development is always a good one as well. So what next for me, almost like if I was suitable, what would be my career path with the organisation? What role would you see this role moving into next? And often asked about the incumbent, so who's doing the role currently and where are they going, to understand what that kind of like that next path for that role is quite a good one as well.
Brilliant. We've had a large number of questions. We haven't had time to get to them all tonight, but we will send those on to Rebecca as well, so she'll be able to pick up on some of the points we haven't covered tonight in the webinar. But on the screen now are ways in which if you want to follow up as well, you can get in touch with us. And as well, we've got details of Zurich's military transition programme as well, if you would like to follow up and learn more about the work Zurich's doing to support service leavers with and sort of one of the ways obviously is tonight with what Tracey's delivered to us as well, which has been a really, really fascinating insight and some really good top tips there, Tracey. So thank you. And that's the final thing I'd like to say is thank you, Tracey. Thanks for your time.
You're welcome. I really hope
this evening. Yeah, no, it's been really useful and really insightful as well. So thank you very much for your time, and thank you for everybody that's been participating tonight on the webinar, and we hope to see you again. So without further ado, I'll close the webinar, and good evening to everybody. Thank you.
Thank you.